Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our very first professional development series lecture at the College of Education. This is a new series that we've started because we just want to be more involved in providing professional development. And we know a lot of you are our graduates from undergrad or graduate school, and we want you to feel comfortable coming back to us. We don't want to lose that connection. We think it's very important for our work and for your work as well. So we'll be having a lecture. Right now we're planning 3 times a year. Our next one will be sometime in the summer. It will probably be something on working with special needs children in the regular classroom. Then we'll have one every fall, every spring, every summer. Okay. So my name is Dr. Schall, Janine Schall. I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies here at the College of Education. And I got chosen to be the first one to go first. So I'm going to be talking today about Beyond the STAAR, supporting reading achievement on the test, across the curriculum, and in life outside of school. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can turn kids into readers, how we can support reading achievement both in school and out of school and on the test. I have to admit the test is not my primary concern, but I know it is an important thing for us in the schools. So I'm going to be talking about what is reading, what does it mean to be a literate person, why succeeding on the STAAR is not the only thing that matters, and why relying on standardized test scores can sometimes be a barrier to actually creating readers. And what we can do, several things that we can do to help kids be lifelong readers who choose to read, to enjoy it, to find out more information, and to use it in their day-to-day life for economic success, for social success, for civic success. So for our purposes today, go back. What is reading? And what does it mean to be literate? If you read the professional literature, all the scholars and the academics who write about what is reading, who research what is reading, you're going to find dozens of definitions, hundreds probably of definitions. So for right now, take just a couple minutes, turn to somebody who's sitting at the table, introduce yourself if you don't already know the people at your table, say what school you're from, what you teach, and then talk about your definition of reading. What is reading? What does it mean to be a literate person? Okay, just take a couple minutes. All right, finish up your last comments. I'm going to show you a variety of definitions from various scholars and academics in the field. All these definitions are taken from the Literacy Dictionary, the Vocabulary of Reading and Writing, which is a great book about the basics of literacy. So see where your own definition falls, where what you were just talking about. See what it's most similar to in these definitions that I'm going to show you. So our first one is from Plato. So even over 1,000 years ago, they were discussing what reading is, what literacy is. Plato said that it's distinguishing the separate letters both by the eye and by the ear in order that when you later hear them spoken or see them written, you will not be confused by their position. So Plato was very into the alphabet and the phonics. Okay. Other definitions. Bloomfield, way back in 1938. We've been talking about this for a long time. He said it was nothing more than the correlation of a sound image with a corresponding visual image. Thorndike, 1922, had a very simple definition. He said reading is reasoning. So he's all about the mental processes and the thinking. Gray, in 1940, says it's a central thought process by means of which meaning is put into the symbols appearing on the printed page. Okay, so he's sort of a mix of the cognitive and the graphophonemic. We have another definition, the reconstruction of the events behind the symbols. So again, sort of a mixture of symbols and cognition. Goodman in 1975 says it's a sampling, selecting, predicting, comparing, and confirming activity in which the reader selects a sample of useful graphic cues based on what he sees and what he expects to see. Durkin, 1993, intentional thinking during which meaning is constructed through interactions between text and reader. Another one from 1993, transacting with a text to create meaning, bringing meaning to a text in order to create meaning from it. A process of translating signs and symbols into meanings and incorporating the new information into existing cognitive and affective structures. And another one, the process of making discriminative response in the broadest sense, the process of interpreting sense stimuli and adapting one's behavior with regard to them. So that's quite a range of definitions. Okay, there's some agreement, there's some similarities, but there's really a lot of disagreement about what reading is. And if people have been thinking about this since Plato's time, which was over 1,000 years ago, why don't we have a definition? Why don't we have one single, this is what it is? A lot of the confusion about how to teach reading comes from the fact that we don't have a single definition. We have lots of different definitions. And every definition leads to different ways of teaching and different ways of handling reading in the classroom. So why don't we have a definition? Well, there's a number of different reasons. The most important reason is that reading happens in the brain. And it's hard to see into the brain. So you never really know what a reader is doing, what's actually happening in the brain there. So you have to use all sorts of secondary sources, sort of secondary data, sort of implied data. So researchers and scholars, they'll listen to a person read, they'll look at the errors or the miscues that they make, they'll look at patterns of miscues that they make, they'll ask the person, well, what are you doing as you read? How are you making sense of this? But it's all secondary information. It's all kind of incomplete, partial glimpse into what's going on as a person reads. Now, people are starting to do other things. They are starting to use things like eye movement research, which is a research tool that puts a reader in front of a computer, basically, and they'll be reading a book, and there's a laser pointed at their eye, and it tracks exactly where their eye focuses on the page. So it gives you a good idea of what the reader's looking at, and is the reader looking at every word? Is the reader looking at every line, etc. So that's giving us more information about what's happening in the brain. We're also seeing a whole bunch of researchers now starting to use a variety of different brain scans. So to look at what parts of the brain are active during the reading process, how that changes, etc. And that's giving us more information as well. But still, it's all partial, incomplete data. And it's all, of course, subject to interpretation, as is all data. So you've got researchers, and reading is a big topic of interest. So you've got researchers from the field of psychology, from the field of linguistics, from the field of education, from the field of sociology, all looking at what reading is. And they all have their own set of beliefs, and that all leads them to their own definitions. So if you're a psychologist, you probably see reading as primarily cognitive. If you're a linguist, you probably see it primarily as having to do with various language structures and functions, etc. Okay? In addition, research has historically looked at reading as very isolated. So you see lots of experiments that are just looking at words, word recognition, or reading lists of words. And of course, that's not really how real readers work, right? So that's another complexity there. And finally, everybody has their own set of beliefs about how the world works and how reading works. For example, if you talk to a lot of kids, you talk to a lot of adults, what do you do when you come to a word you don't know? For a lot of people, the very first thing they're going to say is, well, I'll sound it out. Okay? Everybody knows that sounding out works. Of course, it doesn't. It's an incredibly inefficient and ineffective tool for figuring out an unfamiliar word. Okay? Research shows that. But everybody knows that that's true. So we're all operating from the set of beliefs that maybe doesn't have basis in fact. So we don't have a really good definition of what reading is, although we have a lot of different people talking about reading. Legislation right now, the rules that are sort of governing what we do in our classrooms are looking at reading in a really, really narrow focus. So if you look at the National Reading Panel report, if you look at No Child Left Behind, which has really, really shaped what you all have to do in your classrooms, they are looking at reading as having 5 components. This is probably very familiar to all of you. They have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, right? That comes directly from the National Reading Panel and was put into law pretty much in the No Child Left Behind. In terms of scholarship, in terms of research, there's not a whole lot of support for that, for looking at reading in that way. What scholars are doing with reading now, and the ways that they're looking at reading and literacy now, are looking at it in a much more comprehensive, a much broader way. So looking at reading not just how do you read words, but looking at reading as how does it become part of your life? How do you become a reader? Not just you can read, but you're actually a reader. What role does it play in your life? What role does it play in who you are? And how can schools help people reach their full potential in terms of literacy? So modern definitions are really bringing together research from a variety of fields, from linguistics, from education, from sociology, et cetera, from psychology. And they're looking at research, they're looking at reading and literacy in very contextualized situations. So there's several good definitions that I like right now, but the one that I'm currently really working with is Stephen Kuchar and his dimensions of literacy. So his take on reading, as you can see, is a very comprehensive look at what reading is. And in fact, he doesn't use the term reading. He uses the term literacy, which is how most people have moved who are in this field. Now, the laws haven't moved to that there. The legislation hasn't kind of dribbled down into schools, but in the field of reading, the people whose life's work it is to look at what reading is, they don't talk about reading anymore. They talk about literacy. So Kuchar says that literacy is dynamic and multidimensional in nature. Becoming or being literate means learning to effectively, efficiently, and simultaneously control the linguistic, cognitive, sociocultural, and developmental dimensions of written language in a transactive fashion. And this is the little symbol that he's come up with, or the graphic. So I want to look at each part of this and use an example to illustrate it. And then you guys are going to be thinking about your own classrooms or your own kids and thinking about how this will play out in their situation. So at the core of every literacy event is the cognitive dimension. That's the desire of the language user, of the child, of the reader, to explore, discover, share meaning, create meaning. So in the cognitive dimension, the core here, the reader is constructing meaning through a variety of processes and strategies, mental processes and strategies. Now on your tables, you each have copies of the Reading and Literacy Master's Degree Fact Sheet. We're going to be using it as an example for these different dimensions. So this fact sheet is a pretty typical text that an adult might find, if an adult who's looking for a graduate program. It's a pretty typical flyer or brochure to get information across to adults. So as a reader, looking at that, thinking about the cognitive dimension, this plays out in the strategies that you're using to make sense out of that fact sheet. So as you're looking at the words, as you're looking at the phrases, how it's organized, how do you make sense out of it? You might be doing something like questioning. So as you look at it, you're coming up with a whole bunch of questions. Well, what does this mean? Or I need to ask the program coordinator about this, or I don't understand what this class would be, or how long would it take me to... So you're coming up with a lot of questions. That's a mental strategy that people use very commonly to make sense out of text. Okay. You might be visualizing yourself. Okay. You might be visualizing yourself as a student in the program. Okay, This says that the classes start, I think it says after 4:30 p.m. on there. Well, if I was going to do that, you have this mental picture in your head, okay, I have to close down my classroom, get into my car, and drive to the campus. And so you're visualizing to make sense. Okay, that's another mental strategy that's very, very common. Surrounding the cognitive dimension is the linguistic dimension. This is the language vehicle through which meaning is expressed, to be formal. So it includes all the linguistic systems like phonics, like the alphabetic principle, like syntax, grammar, semantics, word meaning, all of that. All of that is within the linguistic dimension. So returning to the fact sheet, using the linguistic dimension, how the linguistic dimension might play out there. For example, you might see the word practicum and not know what it means because it's not a common word outside of certain educational situations. So if you were in that situation, you might use your graphophonemic knowledge, your linguistic knowledge, and notice that the first part of practicum looks a lot like the word practice. So, okay, they look a lot alike. Maybe they mean pretty much the same thing. Okay, you're using your graphophonemic knowledge to figure out the unknown word. The next dimension is sociocultural. Literacy events are always social. They always take place in a social context. They're never really isolated. So meaning is created, and ways that language is used is always, always social, and as Kuchar would say, framed by a social identity. So that's the sociocultural dimension of literacy. And as you look at the fact sheet again, okay, this is the form, the organization, the structure of the fact sheet, like I said, is fairly typical. And the person who created it knew that it was fairly typical, and that's why they used that particular form. Okay, so knowing that that's the social context, this is a brochure trying to get information across to people, this is the form I'm going to use. Okay, that's the social context. And of course, literacy is developmental. So we're constantly becoming literate. It's a process that really never ends. Every literacy act, every time we interact with a piece of text, we do some writing, we read, we are, the literacy user is interacting with pieces of literacy that they may control or may not control. So if they can control that aspect of literacy, we say that they're literate, at least in that aspect. If they don't control it, well, they're developing literacy in that aspect. So literacy development never really ends. People are continuing to encounter new literacy events throughout their life. Sometimes we hear people say that they learn to read and they're going to learn to read by 3rd grade. Well, yeah, we hope kids have the very basics of reading down by 3rd grade, but that doesn't mean they're done reading or learning to read. They're still learning to read in 4th grade and 5th grade and 8th grade and 12th grade and college. Okay? Because as you move through every grade level, every aspect of your life, you're encountering new types of text that you have to learn to read. So, for example, in my personal life, when I entered graduate school, when I went to my master's degree and then to my doctoral degree, I was a good reader at that point. I'd gone through college. I'd been a teacher for a number of years. I was a good reader. And then all of a sudden, I was looking at these texts that were very, very academic, very, very theoretical. There was no, it wasn't narrative. There weren't examples in there. It was just dense academic text. And there was a while there that I was, what do I do? How do I read this? Okay? That was an aspect of literacy that, for me, was still developing. Okay? I was, 34 at that point, something like that. And I was still developing my literacy in that aspect. And it happens for all of us, okay? For all of us. The first time you read a tax form, that's probably going to be a developing area of literacy for you, right? And then once you have some experience with tax forms, if you haven't given it all up and given it to the accountant, once you have some experience with tax forms, then you become a literate person in tax forms, right? And it happens with kids as well. So they may be very literate in reading narrative, but then you give them a poem and they have no idea how to read a poem. They're still developing that sort, okay? So developmental dimension of literacy occurs throughout your life. So returning to the fact sheet again, that particular literacy event, if you were looking at it, it's probably fairly easy for you all to read. You're all very educated people. You're all good readers. maybe you're going to come across something you're not familiar with, like maybe the phrase transnational literacies might be something you haven't heard of. So if it's unfamiliar for you, you probably have a lot of strategies so you could figure it out. You maybe think, well, I'm just going to look it up when I get home, or I'm going to ask the person sitting next to me, or, well, it's trans, and I know trans means across, and national, so across nations maybe. So you have ways that you can figure it out, and once you figure that out, you're more developed in that, okay? So continuing for everybody. Another quick look is just another way to look at the same model. This takes Kuchar's definition or Kuchar's dimensions of literacy with linguistic, cognitive, sociocultural, developmental, and just expands them a little bit. Okay, this is taking labels created by Alan Luke, who's a really interesting scholar in the field of literacies and multiliteracies. So linguistic, working with the language systems, phonics, grammar, syntax. Kids are code breakers and code makers. That's their role within that dimension. In the cognitive area, all the mental processes and strategies, kids are meaning makers. In the sociocultural dimension, kids are text users and text critics. And in the developmental dimension, kids are scientists and construction workers. They're continuing to construct who they are as a literate person and how they approach texts. So, think about your own kids, your own classroom, maybe yourself as a reader. Think about a typical literacy event that might play out in your own life or in your classroom. So maybe a read aloud experience, or a child reading independently, or whatever happens in your classroom. And think about what, wrong button, sorry. Think about what it looks like. So for that linguistic dimension, whatever your literacy event is, what are kids doing as readers in terms of working with the linguistic structures, the grammar, the syntax, the phonics, the word knowledge? What are they doing with the cognitive? What strategies might they be using? Are they questioning? Are they visualizing? Are they synthesizing information? Are they inferring? What strategies are they using, or could they be using? Sociocultural. So how are they particular text users? How does this play a role in who they are as a reader, and what's important for them, or what society says is important for them to know and do? And developmental, how are they growing? How are they learning? What are they doing in that way? Take a few minutes to think about your own classroom, talk to the people next to you, and see how some of these aspects or dimensions of literacy would play out in your own classroom.
She's always on AR. I have to go read a book, because now they can do it from home, not in our test, but they can read books that are in their
All right, guys, finish up your final thoughts. So these dimensions of literacy are playing out in every literacy event in our classroom. Every time a child reads, every time we read, or every time a child writes, every time we talk about reading or writing. If reading and writing is really this comprehensive, if the act of being literate, being a reader, is really this comprehensive, then what is a literate person? Because our goal in schools is not just to create kids who can master the skill of reading and then never choose to read. Right? Our goal is to create readers, is to create literate people who can use reading, use text, use their literate knowledge to build really strong lives, strong social lives, economic lives, civic lives. So, what's a literate person? Looking at the work of Stephen Kuchar, of Alan Luke, of a lot of other scholars, some of my own ideas, here's a partial list of what it means to be literate and what our goal as educators and in our schools, what we should be producing. This is partial. These ideas are somewhat interrelated. There's, I'm sure, other things that we can add on here. But it includes things like a literate person can make meaning out of a variety of texts. That's pretty basic, right? So they can read narratives, they can read picture books, they can read novels, dramas, poetry, nonfiction, newspapers, procedures, directions, and they can make meaning out of all of those at whatever level is appropriate for their age. We also want people who voluntarily read. They don't read because they're forced to. They don't read just because they get points or they get prizes. They read because they want to read. And they'll voluntarily read. They may even, when they go home, choose to read instead of choosing to play a video game, occasionally at least. Okay? So they voluntarily choose to read both for pleasure and for finding out information. We want people who know how to locate appropriate texts for specific information, for specific purposes. They have something they need to know, they need to do. They can go out, find the information, the appropriate information, interpret the appropriate information. They don't need people to tell them what to read, to show them what to read. They can find it themselves by going to the library, by going online, however. We want people who can read critically, who aren't just going to take whatever you give them and say, oh yeah, that's true. We want people who can think critically, who can evaluate the reading, who can look for bias, who can look for authors' purpose, authors' identify propaganda, etc. There are far too many people out there right now who believe everything they read online. If it's online, it has to be true, right? Okay? No. That's very, very, very wrong. And we need people who can evaluate what they find online as well as evaluate what they find in newspapers and magazines, et cetera. If we don't have that, I mean, eventually it's going to be really, really bad for our democracy. In order to have a democracy, in order to have citizens who vote and who can evaluate the issues, you have to have people who can read critically. And if they can't, it means really bad things for our country. We want people who read to participate in economic life and in civic life. So we want people who can read for their jobs, or who have the level of literacy, the types of literacy they need to succeed in a variety of jobs, whether they choose to be a teacher or a banker or a journalist or a doctor or a business owner or whatever. Every type of economic activity, well, not every type, but almost every type of economic activity requires some level of literacy. We need people to read for civic life, like we talked about before. Adults vote in this country, and that's a great thing. We hope they're voting informed, okay? And you can't be informed unless you have some level of literacy, okay? And you know how to go out and find the information and evaluate it. We want people to participate in literacy communities. We want people who talk about texts with other people, who share books, who join book clubs, who read a newspaper article at home and then go and talk about it with their colleague at work. We want people who recommend books to other people. We want people who go to libraries and go to bookstores and have magazine subscriptions or read online. We want people who participate in the literacy community. And that begins in the schools. All of this begins in the schools. Home, of course, plays a really important role. Society as a whole plays a really important role. But we have them in school for 12 years at the minimum. They spend a lot of time with us. Okay? It's our job to be doing these things as well. And of course, can't forget this one, we want people who can show their literacy skills, who can be assessed on their literacy skills and do a good job, who can pass the standardized test, the STAAR or the TEKS for those few grade levels who are still doing the TEKS, or for whatever other exam is out there. I don't particularly like standardized tests, but they're a fact of life, and kids are going to encounter them throughout their entire life. So we want kids who can do well on them. Now, I need to note that this is a definition of a literate person for our particular time and place. This is what I think is important right now in our country. But literacy means different people, different things to different people at different times. So what it meant to be literate 200 years ago is incredibly different from what it means to be literate. There we go. From what it means to be literate now. 200 years ago, people didn't need to know how to read. A number of religious people would know how to read. Priests often knew how to read. Monks often, not always, knew how to read. The wealthy would often know how to read. The Bible was a primary text, at least in our culture. But the regular everyday people didn't need to know how to read. It wasn't necessary for success. So what did it mean to be literate? In a lot of contexts, it meant either knowing how to read the Bible. In some contexts, it meant knowing how to sign your name. Okay? You could sign your name, you were literate. That doesn't go today, right? We would be incredibly shocked if that was what it meant to be literate today. What it means to be literate today is that list that I showed you, and I'm sure other things as well. We've got people here looking at their cell phones. Another complexity to literacy today is technological literacy, knowing how to use the cell phones and iPads and computers and all of that. There's also nothing on that list that I showed you that's really language dependent. There's nothing that says this has to happen in English, or that it has to happen in a standard language even, standard English or standard Spanish. Of course, we do live in a context where some people in the United States would say that if you're not reading and writing in English, you're not literate. I wouldn't agree with that, but it is what some people would say. But being a literate person really doesn't depend on your language. You can be literate in really powerful ways in any language. So if the definition of literacy is not standard, it changes over time, well, probably it's changing more now than ever before, more quickly now than ever before. Students today are experiencing text in their context and not in our context. Okay? This is sometimes kind of hard, and schools haven't really caught up with this often. But we need to recognize that the way kids experience literacy is not the way that we grew up experiencing literacy. And what we do in our schools to help kids become literate can't be the same thing that we did in our schools 20 years ago or 50 years ago. It has to change. So my grandmother grew up with print and radio. My mother grew up with print and television. My mother, her family got her first television when she was a senior in high school. This was back in 1953 or something like that. Personally, I grew up with print, television, and movies. The VCR came out when I was a teenager. We got our first VCR after much, 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 much begging on the part of my sister and me when I was, I think, a freshman in high school. And so movies were big. Going to the movies was big, right? Our kids are growing up with? They're growing up with print. They're growing up with television. They're growing up with movies. But they're also being creators of these things now. Anybody can put up a video on YouTube. It's easy to make movies nowadays. It's easy to create a podcast. It's easy to share your creation with the world. And that's really the way the world is moving. So, why does this all matter? We know that people can have good lives without being highly literate. People do it all the time. But we do want people to have a very high literacy attainment, and it matters for our country, it matters for the individual people. We know that high literacy attainment opens lots and lots of doors to economic success, to social success. We know that the more literate you are, generally, the more literate that you are, the higher education you have, the more money you'll earn over your lifetime. There's a really great chart that just shows, how much a person with a GED or a person with a little bit of high school education will earn over their lifetime. A person with a GED, a person with college experience, a person with a master's degree, and it just goes up, 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 up. Okay. We know for literary readers, people who read books and novels, that they attend cultural events more often than non-literary readers. We know that they attend sporting events more often than non-literary readers. We know that they do higher levels of exercise. I'm not sure what the connection is, but there is a connection, at least a causal connection. They do more volunteering in their communities. And they are less likely, overall, they are less likely to be incarcerated. There's a really great website. I encourage you all to look at it. It's the National Report Card, America's Report Card, National Report Card, something like that. And they do a lot of surveys. They collect a lot of research. And one thing that they've done is prison surveys. So they look at the literacy levels of prisoners and compare it to that of people who are not incarcerated. And overall, people who are in jail have much lower levels of literacy. I found it really interesting, and I'm not going to talk about it too much because I don't really know why this happens, but I found it really interesting, though, that when they break it down by racial groups, for African Americans and for Latinos, people who are in jail tend to have higher levels of literacy than people who are not in jail. So don't let that discourage you from educating your students, but I hope somebody is looking at that more closely to figure out why that is, but I found that really interesting. But overall, there's a very strong correlation between literacy levels and incarceration. So it matters. It matters that our kids are highly literate. So let's look at this list again of what is a literate person. Now, where do schools place most of their efforts? At least schools here in the Rio Grande Valley. Okay. So mostly, most schools currently are placing most of their efforts in kids being able to show their literacy success through standardized tests, okay, or through some sort of standardized measure. And of course, there's lots of good reasons for that. I'm not sure there's lots of good educational reasons for that, but there's lots of good other reasons for that, because it's an incredibly high-stakes situation, right? You have to pass the test. And honestly, it's not too much to ask. It's a standardized test. It's not, scaling Mount Everest. It's just a test. And highly literate people will be able to pass that test. But if this is our effort, the majority of our effort, what's happening here? Where are kids learning this? So the STAAR, any standardized test, is based on a set of standards that the state has decided the students need to know. And if you've looked at those standards, it's not a bad set of standards. It's not what I personally would have written, but it's not bad. It's realistic for kids. So it seems logical that if they can pass the Reading STAAR, that they know how to read and that they're going to be literate people, right? Unfortunately, that's not always true, at least when you think of how many schools across the country really are approaching standardized testing right now. So if you revisit the dimensions of literacy, and look at how what we do in school plays into these dimensions. The STAAR exam, the TEKS, the Texas exam, whatever, every standardized test I've pretty much ever looked at, really focuses very strongly on the linguistic dimension of reading. So it's focused very strongly on things like word recognition, on things like the phonics knowledge, on grammar, etc. Sometimes we get a little bit of the cognitive, but sociocultural is almost entirely ignored. And developmental, there's some sort of nod to developmental with the knowledge that a third grader should have different expectations than a fourth grader. But we've actually seen that as standardized tests have become more and more powerful in our schools, that our expectations for kids are rising in ways that are not developmentally appropriate. So for example, the work that people do nowadays in kindergarten is the work that they used to in first grade. And unfortunately, often, it's not work that's developmentally appropriate for kindergartners. Okay? So because the exam is so high stakes, because it's so important that we pass this exam, schools tend to focus mostly on this dimension of literacy. It makes sense. They have to do it to pass the exam. If we don't pass the exam, we get in trouble. Our kids are in trouble, we're in trouble, our schools are in trouble. So we're going to focus there. It's totally logical. However, it's kind of getting in our way of creating readers. It will help kids learn to read, which is important, but it doesn't necessarily help us create readers and create literate people. So this is a cartoon, came up on my Facebook feed a few weeks ago. You may have seen it. So if standardized tests are focusing really strongly on the linguistic aspect of literacy, what are they missing? And they're missing all of these things, which are, of course, things that are very important that we want kids and adults to have, right? So I want to look briefly at standardized testing and then move into what can we do in our classrooms and our schools to really support not just kids passing the test, because of course that's important, but how do we really create readers? So standardized testing, just very briefly. We know that standardized tests are tests that are administered, scored, interpreted in standard manner. So what you do here in Mission should be exactly the same as what's happening in Dallas, right? We know that they most often involve multiple choice questions given to very large numbers of students. Standardized tests are great for assessing large numbers of students. They are really bad at assessing individual students. Their sole purpose is to quantify what students know and what they're able to do. And criterion-referenced tests like the STAAR, like the TAKS, are based on standards, very clear standards developed by some body, in this case developed by the state, which is derived by what the community, what the state thinks is important for kids to know. Whenever you're looking at a standardized test, in any test, whether it's the STAAR or the GRE or the Texas, whatever, it's really important to know who developed the standards and what set of beliefs were they operating out of. So it's always important to question that. Don't just take, this is the STAAR, they're giving it to me, and it's like the Bible. It has to be right, okay? The STAAR and any exam, any test is operating out of a particular set of beliefs that may not be a good set of beliefs. Maybe it is. So it is possible for everybody, it is possible for everybody to master the standards in criterion-referenced tests like the STAAR. Theoretically, it's possible for everybody to pass and get 100, to do incredibly well, because that's what a criterion-referenced test is. However, we all know that if that happens, if too many kids get a really good grade on the test, then people are going to look at that and say, well, the test must be too easy. Okay? How can it be that everybody's passing the test? Nobody ever thinks, wow, our teachers are doing such a good job. Okay? They think, that test must be too easy. Or they think that you're cheating. Okay? And so what tends to happen, if everybody does well on the test, what tends to happen is that they raise the standards or they change the test. So all of a sudden, people stop doing so well. So in a way, you're actually punished for doing well on the test. It's a kind of a nasty cycle that people get into, or standardized tests get into. So why are standardized tests, why is just succeeding on the test not enough to create good readers, to create truly literate people? And why does it sometimes get in the way of creating truly literate people? Well, test makers, any type of standardized test, they try to level the playing field so that everybody has a fair chance to answer the question and do well. So they try to completely eliminate background knowledge as a component. So they try, now we know this is impossible to do. Okay, if you know anything about learning, it's impossible to eliminate background knowledge because that's how you learn. You connect things to your background knowledge. But they try to remove any possibility of people using background knowledge on the test. So if kids use background knowledge on their test, they generally tend to do more poorly than kids who don't. Okay? Well, in real life, of course, we want kids to use their background knowledge. We know that's very powerful in learning and in making sense out of text. They are, of course, generally written by a bunch of people who really don't know anything about the test taker. You know, they're written by a committee somewhere far away and may not be culturally appropriate. They have a very unique format. The sort of genre of standardized testing is unique. You're not going to find it anywhere else other than on a standardized test. So if they can master the genre of standardized testing, that doesn't mean that they can master the genre of mystery or science fiction or drama or poetry or whatever. So they have a very unique format. Every genre, we know every genre has its own rules. So mystery has its own rules of how it's written, how it's organized, the type of characters you have. Chick lit has its own rules, the type of characters you have, the situations they'll find them in. Poetry has its own rules. Standardized testing have their own rules too. Okay? So the unique format, they have a really particular way of treating content. So on standardized tests, the skills are very isolated. There's nothing that's connected to each other. You're jumping from topic to topic to topic to topic to topic. There's a very specific set of vocabulary that kids don't experience in real life. That's really very standardized test vocabulary. So they don't generally run across it in their daily classroom work. There's particular procedures that they have to follow. Like, you know, maybe you'll take everything off the wall and they have to sit at their desk and desks are separated or whatever you do. You know, you have to read out the rules even though kids already know the rules or whatever your procedures are. They tend to have hyper English. That's English that's so correct because they don't want to confuse anybody. They don't want there to be any misunderstandings. So they try to make their English so correct that it ends up being English that nobody ever uses. And so it's very confusing to kids. And they tend to have challenging vocabulary, not just in the question itself, which would be what's being tested, but also in the directions. So kids have to understand this difficult vocabulary in the question itself before they even get to the content that they're supposed to be tested on. So because standardized testing is its own unique genre, there are rules for reading standardized tests that are not the rules for reading real text. So for reading novels or magazines, newspapers, etc. So how are standardized test reading different from real reading? Here's a bunch of ways. In real life, you set your own purpose for reading. You decide, here's my newspaper, I'm going to read the editorial section and I'm going to read the sports section. Okay. On the test, the purpose is set by the test makers. In real life, you read what you want to read. You read the genres you enjoy. You read the formats that you want to read. I love reading short stories. I hate reading poetry, so I'm going to read a lot of short stories. On the test, you read what they give you to read. In real life, you read extended text. You read novels. Okay, you read magazine articles that are very long. On the test, texts are short and they're often excerpts. So they may be, you know, a long text, maybe 4 pages. Okay? You just don't have time to read long texts on a standardized test. In real life, you use lots of sources to make sense out of text. We want people to do this, right? We want them to consult a dictionary. We want them to talk to the teacher. We want them to talk to a friend. We want them to use their background knowledge. On standardized tests, they're only supposed to use what's on the test. And bringing background knowledge into the test actually hurts them. So too much reliance on your own schema when you're taking a test will actually interfere with passing the test. In real life, you make connections. We want kids to make connections, right? Too many connections can interfere. And in real life, we read connected text. But on the test jumps from genre to genre to genre, to subject to subject. So the reading tasks are different. Now, this is one reason that just like we teach kids to read mysteries, just like we teach them to read poetry, just like we teach them to read all these genres, we have to teach them how to read standardized tests. So some test preparation, good quality test preparation is important. But if our major focus is on turning reading assignments into what they look like on the test, we are absolutely 100% helping them pass the test. There's no question about that. But we are not helping them be readers in real life. So, are standardized tests bad? No, actually, not really. No, they aren't. They can be a really useful evaluation tool. The STAAR can be a really useful evaluation tool when you're comparing a large group of people. They're not particularly appropriate for comparing individual kids. That's not what tests are designed for. The testing company will tell you that. So while standardized tests aren't really bad in and of themselves, sometimes the way that we deal with them in schools is really twisting literacy education in ways that's not helping kids grow up to be true readers and truly literate people in the broad sense of being literate. Because tests are so high stake, because there's so much pressure on getting passing scores, many schools have really altered their curriculums and altered the way that they're telling teachers to teach, requiring teachers to teach in many cases, so that everything looks like the standardized test. So, we see it all the time. We see a lot of kids who don't like to read. They know how to read, but they don't like to read. They don't choose to read. They'll do anything other than to read. Don't make me read, please. Don't make me read. Okay? We see kids who don't know how to find information. We see kids who don't know how to evaluate information. We see kids who are afraid to think or to share their thinking about texts. If you ask them a question that requires more than just really a literal level interpretation, a lot of kids can't do it because they've been trained not to do it. Now, the STAAR, because the STAAR is so new, I know the STAAR says it really emphasizes critical thinking. Maybe that's going to change in some ways. At this point, what I've really seen is people taking like old tax test preparation and calling it STAAR. So I don't know that it's changing yet, but maybe it will as we get more information about that test. We'll see what happens there. All right. So just to make it totally clear, I'm not trying to dump on any teacher or any school, because I think what teachers are doing in the schools and what they're often required, not what they're voluntarily doing, but they're often told to do, it's totally logical if your goal is to pass the test. Totally logical. And there's such high pressure that it makes sense to do these things. But I think our schools, our principals, our politicians, our school boards need to remember that the test is should be just a sliver of school life. Our goal is to create truly literate people. By the way, this whole testing movement, I could talk about tests forever. I'm only going to talk about it for like 30 seconds more, I promise. It's a whole nother workshop there. But the whole testing accountability movement started because our schools are doing so badly. It's a total lie. It's a total lie. If you look at the NAEP scores, National American Educational Progress, I think it is, scores that tests kids across the entire country. Even if you look at those rankings, what countries are getting the highest literacy achievement. The United States is 7th on there, 8th on there, something like that. And oh my gosh, we're 7th out of 300 countries in the world, something like that. But then you look at it more closely and you look, well, how statistically significant are those differences? And it turns out they're not really significantly statistically different. So whether you get you're ranked 3rd or you're ranked 7th is pretty much the same thing in terms of actual achievement. Anyway, if you look at like NAEP scores, again, this Nation's Report Card website has a lot of charts and scores and things. But if you look at the NAEP scores over the past 35 years, which is as long as they've been recording them, standardized tests, the accountability movement's been in place for about 10 years now. In Texas, it's a little bit longer because this is where it all started. There's been pretty much no growth. I mean, the scores have held pretty much standard across grade levels, at least in terms of statistical significance. There's a few points growth maybe. But in terms of statistical significance, there's been no change in the past 35 years with how well our kids are doing. So are our kids doing worse than ever? Are schools failing? Well, no, they're doing pretty much the same as they always have been. And in fact, because our population as a whole in this country has gotten poorer and has gotten, we have much higher numbers of second language speakers now, or language learners. That's actually meaning if we can hold our scores where they have been, where they were 35 years ago, if we can hold our scores with this new population, we're actually doing better than we used to do. That doesn't mean we don't have areas where we need to work on. Absolutely we do. There's absolutely areas where we have to do better than we are now. But this whole sort of rhetoric about how badly our schools are doing it's rhetoric, it's not reality. Oh, this is the NAEP. This is just showing the Texas scores from 2009 to 2011. I know you probably can't see that at all from where you are, but basically these little diamonds mean that there's no statistical significant, or there's no significant change in the test scores. And so if you look here, it looks like things are going up. So there's a few points, I think it's like 4 or 5 points difference between the 2 years, but that's not a statistically significant change. Okay, so what can we do? How do we get kids to succeed on the STAAR? How do we get them to pass the test, which matters, but how do we also turn them into readers, which matters even more? How do we get them to be truly literate people? I'm going to talk about, very quickly, I'm going to talk about 5 different things that we need to be doing. These are all kind of interrelated. They're not in any particular order, which one is most important than the other. And honestly, none of them are groundbreaking or none of them are really new. These are things that we've been talking about and that we've known that would need to happen for years and years and years. And in some places they are absolutely happening. And in other places they're not. So first of all, and most importantly in my opinion, is surrounding kids with text. Making our classrooms drown in print. Having our classrooms filled with books, having poetry posted on the walls, having student writing displayed, having anchor charts, posting maps, having directions. Our classrooms need to be drowning in print, an authentic print that kids want to read. We need to be doing regular read-alouds across the curriculum. All grade levels. High school students love read-alouds. Kinder students, of course, love read-alouds. We need to be doing read-alouds in all subjects. There are tremendous resources out there, books, nonfiction books, poetry, for math, for social studies, for science. Every classroom needs to have a classroom library that kids can regularly access. It needs to be filled with fiction, with nonfiction, with magazines, with atlases, with songbooks. It needs to have multiple grade levels. So if you teach a 2nd grade classroom, you need to have books in your classroom that are wordless. You need to have books in your classroom that are appropriate for preschool. You need to have books in your classroom that are appropriate for 4th grade, because you're going to have that range in your classroom. We need to be using literature across the curriculum. We need to be using literature, magazine articles, newspaper articles in math, in science, and social studies, because that's what happens in real life. If you're a scientist, you are reading all the time. You're reading magazine articles, you're reading journal articles, you're reading lab reports. If you're a historian, you're reading all the time. So in our classes where we are preparing people to be mathematicians and historians and doctors and teachers and all, we need to be reading all the time. Okay. So, very quickly, turn to somebody next to you. What are you doing, or what could you do? How are you meeting these goals? Or what could you do to get closer to meeting these goals?
Paragraphs, like questions that they've done, and put them up in hundreds, and it's great for them to put them up where they're sitting down, like papers are hanging like in front of them, like right here, with like the bookmark has poetry, and then like the different kinds of poetry, like you hang.
All right. In the interest of time, the second major important thing that we need to be doing is providing our kids with independent reading time. Good readers read. That's very, very clear in the research, that good readers read. The more a child reads, the better they get at reading. So we need to give kids time to practice the skills and strategies that they're learning. We need kids to give kids time to practice and to develop their literacy through reading. When kids are exposed to reading, when they have time to read things that they enjoy reading, they learn that reading is fun. They learn that reading is a good choice. This could be happening through DEAR time, through SSR time, whatever you want to call it. But at some point in the day, there needs to be time for kids to read. Free choice, they can bring in anything they want, get from your classroom library. They can read a magazine or a newspaper or a book or an atlas. Of course, for this to work, you have to have a large collection of books available. Okay? But kids need to read. They have to have time to read. We wouldn't expect someone to learn basketball by going to a series of practices where, okay, guys, today the only thing we're going to do is dribble. Let's dribble. Let's dribble again. And tomorrow the only thing we're going to learn is to pass. Here's how you pass. That's not good enough. Pass again. Do it again. Do it 10 times. Okay? At some point, they have to play basketball. They have to get on a court. And they do a lot of that, right? We wouldn't ask someone to learn math just by doing math flashcards day after day after day after day after day, and that's it. Okay, you've mastered the flashcards, you know math now, right? No, kids need to be doing math. They need to be using the manipulatives, they need to be doing practice questions, they need to be doing math. Same thing with reading. We can't just teach kids how to read. We have to give them time to read. Sometimes I've heard from people who have principals who will come in and say, you're wasting your time. Why are they just sitting there reading? You're wasting time. I hope you don't have a principal who says that. If they do, of course be polite to them, but feel a little sorry for them because they clearly don't understand anything about reading. Reading needs to happen. Independent reading time needs to happen. There's a lot of research that shows good readers read. Okay. We need to make reading social. We need to make reading social. Frank Smith calls it joining the literacy club. That means that kids who feel like they are readers will learn how to read. If a child feels like reading's not for them, I can't read, nobody I know reads, it's not cool for people to read, it's going to be much harder for them to learn how to read. The affective, emotional part of it is so strong. So we have to help kids join the literacy club. We have to make reading social. Kids read when their friends read. Of course, you have to be a good model for reading. Hopefully you all love to read. Hopefully you go in and you talk about the books. Kids, I'm sorry I didn't grade your spelling tests, but I was at the last chapter of this great book and I just couldn't put it down. Okay? I mean, things like that show that you are a reader, that people read. But kids read when their friends read, especially. Books don't stand alone. Every popular series out there has a web page, has a website. They have discussion boards. They have blogs. We should be setting up structures in our classroom so kids can trade books with each other, so kids can recommend books with each other, so kids can talk about books with each other. Literature circles, book clubs, a blog, a class blog, however you do it. Kids need to know that their friends read, and so reading is good. We know that when struggling readers read with friends or read with somebody else, they will persist longer. Sometimes with the struggling readers, we kind of separate them because they need to work more on their skills, and so they never get that time to read. But if they can read with their friends, that will help them as much or more than another lesson about a skill that they've already learned. Okay. We need to, making literacy social. We need to give students texts that they want to read and that they can read. One of my hardest lessons to learn as a brand new first-year teacher way back in 1992 was that the books that I love are not the books that kids will necessarily love. I remember I took in the book Hatchet by Gary Paulson to my 5th grade class, and I adored the book Hatchet. It's such an exciting survival story. It's just wonderful. So I was all excited. I did it as a read aloud. And like by the 2nd chapter, my kids were flopping over on their desks. They were so bored. Oh. It was painful. It was a painful experience. But I realized that just because I love a book doesn't mean that kids are going to love a book. They're in a totally different stage of life than I am. Why would we enjoy the same things? So you have to give kids they want to read. If the materials that you're always using in your classroom are boring to kids, well, why are they going to think that reading's a good thing to do? You also need to take things like grade level with a huge grain of salt. I know things are all leveled, and this is a 5th grade book, and a 4th grade book, and a 12th grade book, but grade level is actually a really kind of problematic concept because we know that kids understand books based on certain things. So if they love dinosaurs and they know a lot about dinosaurs, they're going to be able to read books at a higher level about dinosaurs than about a different topic that they don't know anything about. They can read harder texts on things that they know a lot about, they really care about, they're really interested in, than other types of texts. So just be careful with grade level, the whole concept. The majority of reading that the kids do needs to be at the child's independent reading level. This means that you have a 4th grade child who's reading at a 1st grade level. The majority of text that they are exposed to needs to be 1st grade text because kids don't learn when the text is too difficult for them. I will occasionally hear something like, well, they're 4th graders, they have to read 4th grade texts. And we have to challenge them. We do have to challenge kids, but little challenges they can meet. If a text is too difficult for a child, a few kids will struggle through because they want to please you. But most kids are just going to be turned off, and they're not going to be learning from it. And the point is, we want kids to learn. So feel free to give kids series books. Like the Boxcar Children books are not great literature. Honestly, they are not. But series books, Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Animorphs, whatever. They help kids love reading. They're very supportive for struggling readers. They're great. I mean, I wouldn't use them as like a class novel or anything, but I would certainly encourage kids to read them on their own. We know that light reading leads to serious reading. So start the kids out with the cartoons, with the graphic novels, with the series books, with the funny books, with the Captain Underpants, with the utterly ridiculous books that appeal to that 9th grade humor. Start them there, hook them, and then move on to more challenging, more difficult topics. And of course, choose books with the child's cultural background in mind, linguistic background in mind. So choose books that reflect, if you have a classroom full of Mexican American kids, a lot of your books, not all of them of course, but a lot of your books should have Mexican American kids in them, okay? And last one, recognize the limitations of things that you are sometimes asked to do or required to do. And possibly, not just recognize the limitations, but start working to educate your colleagues and your principals and your school board and your legislators. No program can ever replace a knowledgeable teacher. There's been a huge move to programs, to scripts, to curriculums that you can just take and implement. They are very, very tempting for principals, for administrators, because they're teacher-proof, which personally, as a former teacher, I find really insulting because I'm a professional and I'm knowledgeable. And why are you trying to teacher-proof away from me? Right? No program can ever replace a knowledgeable teacher, even if it's a good program. Kids are different. They're complex. They're not all the same. They're not standard. So a standard program is not going to fit them all. Contextualized learning, integrated learning is easier for children. We separate reading from writing. We separate history from reading. We separate all of the subjects. We separate everything. We try to isolate skills. We try to cut things down into as small of units as possible. And it's actually making things much harder for kids, because kids are trying to make sense out of the world. And when you chop the world into little pieces, it's harder to make sense out of it. Learning is complex. Kids are complex. Teachers are complex. Be wary of single assessments. Anything that places a huge value judgment on one test score or one assessment, be careful with that. Be wary of that. And realize that no teaching method, no teaching strategy, no matter how wonderful it is going to work for every child. So these are pretty basic things, right? I know we're pretty much out of time here, but let me just wrap up. These are pretty basic things. It's not new information. You've probably heard it before. You may have heard it in your teacher preparation program. The question is now, how can you put it into your classroom? How can you help your school come closer to these ideals? Hopefully your schools are already there. I know some schools are, some classrooms are, but a lot of schools aren't. So the question is, what do you do? Where can you take this? How can you change your own classroom, maybe in tiny little ways, if you're in a school that's very tightly controlled with curriculum, maybe in big ways. And if you are in a school that has very tightly controlled curriculum, how can you start educating your principal and your colleagues and your school board and your legislatures so that we can get closer to helping kids pass the STAAR, but helping kids be literate, helping kids be true lifelong readers, writers, and thinkers. And if you have any, like I said earlier, if you have any topics that you think would work well for this professional development lecture series or for continuing education professional development, please let me know. Any of these things that I talked about today, I could talk about for a long time. So let me know if that's something that people would be interested in. Thank you all.